2024 is indeed going to be a huge change across the world because over 60 countries are going to go to the polls, which is over 4 billion people. And that involves some of the largest democracies in the world, the US, South Africa, India and Indonesia. But of course, it also includes the 67 million good people of the UK. And with the general election on the horizon, or indeed maybe imminent, there is inevitably pressure on parliamentary time. So unfortunately, the Defra Minister for Biosecurity, Animal Health and Welfare, Lord Douglas Miller, cannot be with us in person this year. However, he has taken the time to record his speech to provide an update from the UK government on equine matters. Here is Lord Douglas Miller.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For over 30 years, the National Equine Forum has been the place for the equine world to meet and discuss, and every year, a Defra minister has attended. I regret very much not being there in person, but sadly parliamentary business takes precedence. I hope that you will take from this recording how much the government values the strong relationship we share, and I look forward to meeting many of you soon. You will hear from David shortly about how important this sector is. In government, it is often tempting to think of the billions it brings to the British economy, the thousands of jobs, and as the second largest rural employer, the volume of business it represents, alongside the reputation our sporting events and welfare standards lend to us overseas. My first thought, though, is to the part horses play in our lives and the shared history of our island nation. William the Conqueror, as we have him in the tapestry, riding up, raising his helmet, changing the course of our history. The Duke of Wellington and Copenhagen at Waterloo. Her late Majesty, who inspected the troops for 17 years on her beloved charger Burmese. So I was personally honoured to be called to give the Deaf Review this year, because something which is not always a given in ministerial office. Horses have also been part of my life. I was for a number of years a somewhat reluctant member of the Pony Club, and then that moved on to a much more enthusiastic polo player in the army, and then for many seasons I hunted in Leicestershire. But I know each of you share a similar love, a same passion for horses, so let me move on and update you on the key equine matters the department is driving forward. Coming to this job, my first piece of major legislation has been the Livestock Exports Bill. I was fortunate to meet Roly, who is chairing this session, in his role as Director of the British Horse Council to discuss this sad trade, how it works and how we can stop it. As the bill comes to the committee stage, I'm very appreciative of your support, and the smooth progress so far speaks to your knowledge. As ever in government, we are looking to strike the right balance, working closely with you, APHA, and local authorities. We want to build on established systems to stop horses being exported for slaughter without imposing burdens on legitimate transport, particularly given the extra difficulties of the last few years. Part of that is about working with the British Horse Council on digital ID and traceability. We consulted nearly 2 years ago, and now we have already set out what we would like to do, which I think we are all agreed is very welcome. We have a plan, we have your backing, and now I'm as keen as you are to just get on with it. My officials are working with the supplier of the Central Equine Database to look at the adaptations required to support this. They are also working with the lawyers on amending the equine ID regulations for England to make these necessary changes. The key question is, when is this going to happen, and when are we going to get the legislation? I cannot give you a firm date, but if you will suffer a sporting metaphor, we are in the home straight. The new legislation is currently being drafted, and we are planning its parliamentary schedule. As soon as this is sorted, you will be the first to know. As usual, it is you, the industry, who are ahead of this. Weatherbys 3 years ago introduced their own ePassport system, which has been a great asset to racing, and the Equine Register already do helpful work with their own digital stable. I'm personally keen that we support such work and, as the government, use the latest technology to avoid frustrating duplication and avoid disruption. I know you recognise the different requirements needed from a government system, so I'm grateful for your patience and your help as we get this right. So what does this all mean? It means that where the existing systems can work alongside ours, I'm keen that they do so. I hope that you will appreciate the department's work on this so far, looking at application programming interfaces, for example, which would allow the systems to update each other. We are all looking for the same thing, a system that works without threatening what is already in place. Once the centralised system is established, it will help us better address equine welfare concerns and disease outbreaks. We are grateful already for the British Horse Council's help in setting clear priorities for the animal health and welfare pathway. Where the programme can help with our aims, I'm clear that it should. So we have a busy time in Parliament this year, as I know you will as well. We have an exciting season ahead, the centenary at Cheltenham in a fortnight's time, the Olympics and Paralympics in Paris, which I know Jim and Helen will be telling you about later. These events, which are the pride of the sector and also provide terrific days out for millions of people. So when I think of all the good work you are doing, we are doing together, and will continue to do, I'm always struck by that passion for horses we share and the joy that they bring to our lives. Thank you very much.
So now on to our second presentation, and given the focus on the UK general election, David Mountford is Chief Executive of the British Equine Veterinary Association and winner of today's questions, is going to present a manifesto for the horse. David's extended training as a vet included various jobs at university, including being a pizza delivery driver, a London cycle courier, which is interesting when he was at college in Cambridge, and an extreme photocopier tester. The mind boggles. David is also current chair of the British Horse Council, so very well placed to present a manifesto for the horse. David.
Thank you, Roly. If I'd realised you could present online and not have to answer questions, I think I would have done that. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the Equine Manifesto that we've put together with the next election looming. And as a tribute to Sir Colin Spedding, I thought again this year I'd intersperse with a few Chinese proverbs. Ours is a unique sector. We're proudly British. We play by the rules. We quite like rules, and perhaps more so than some other nations. But we are all independent-minded horse owners. Therefore, like the Chinese proverb says, with heaven being high and the emperor far away, as we live out in the sticks, we're quite often very happy to ignore the rules when it suits us most. I'm hoping our manifesto will allow us to tell government how they can go about providing us with the help and support we need to thrive and flourish without bureaucracy and without the need for us to bend or break the rules from time to time. I need to start off by thanking my co-directors on the British Horse Council for the sterling work they volunteered to do throughout the year. It's a big commitment, and everyone on that board puts a huge amount of time and energy into the horse industry. I also need to thank Peter Lorry, who is the equine industry representative sitting on the Animal Health and Welfare Board for England. His time and energy, his support and his advice has been invaluable to us over the last year. And looking back to this point last year, I finished off with a slide with some take-home messages on, and I thought I really ought to mark ourselves against progress at this point in time. So last year I told you there was lots happening. And we've done a lot of work this year, predominantly on borders, on the issue around importing live horses and the issue around importing germplasm, particularly semen for AI. So there's been a lot of work, but there hasn't been a lot happening on that. And I was surprised to see the Minister didn't mention that, because that's been a big chunk of the things that we've been doing. He did mention horse ID, and it's really exciting to hear him reassure us that we're in the home straight. I have to say, from the British Horse Council's perspective, we felt a little bit as if we were being pushed aside, and deadlines were being pushed back and back and back over the last 12 months. So I hope we can keep his feet to the fire and make sure that that ID legislation does get over the line. And also really excited to hear him mention the animal health and welfare pathway. The equine pathway was something that we've been involved with for a few years, and it felt like it had been pushed into the long grass by Defra over the last 12 months. But if it's come back onto the scene, that's fantastic news for us and will help the industry thrive going forward. Last year I told you that progress was slow, and this year at times it's positively seemed to stagnate. But we've heard there from the Minister that he's keen to move forward, so he's a new Minister. Let's hope that we can see some action. But undoubtedly, that slow movement, the delays in the achieving outcomes, the deadlines moving backwards and backwards, has impacted on our relationship with Defra. We still have regular meetings with them on a fortnightly basis. We still have that strong line of communication, and some of the people we work with are outstanding. But our frustration, I hope you can see, is a little bit evident. One thing that hasn't changed over the last 12 months is the value of us working together as a team. By collaborating and going to government with a single voice, we are much stronger and much more effective. So, on to the manifesto, what I'm here to talk about. Why are we doing a manifesto for the horse? We're not a political party. None of us are standing for election that I know of. And as you will see, the content of the manifesto is manifest. It's stating the bleeding obvious to us, but it isn't for us. It's for those people who are going to be in power. It's for government, it's for the elected officials after this general election. And we need to make them understand who we are, why we matter, and what they can do to help us. So there's two key things that we're trying to achieve in this manifesto. The first is, in a very straightforward way, showing why we're important for their voters, for the people who will put them into power. And the second thing is to tell them, once they're in power, what they can do to help us as an industry thrive and flourish. So how are we going to do that? Well, firstly, we need to do it in a concise fashion. You can bet your bottom dollar that there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of groups who want to have their voices heard by the people who are going into power next. So we need to do this in a structured, concise fashion that is going to grab people's attention and get the key points over quickly, succinctly, and in an easy-to-understand fashion. So we've got 2 pages, 2 sides of A4, that's all. The first side says why the industry is important, why they need to care about it. And it looks at the size, the value, the breadth, and the profile of the industry. Size-wise, you might have seen some of this information before. Size matters. So as you know, and I won again, Jim was second, well done Jim, but not good enough. 3.2 million voters, nearly 2 million voters who ride regularly, and over half of all ex-riders who want to ride again. 1 million horses in the country roughly, and we employ, directly and indirectly, 250,000 individuals. So from just the numbers of people who are going to vote, we are pretty important to people coming into power. And we have significant value economically. 4 billion is contributed by racing alone. 5 billion is contributed by the rest of the industry. We are the country's second largest rural employer, and our overseas trade is worth in excess of £500 million a year. That is all driven by 18,000 businesses around the country. So economically, we have power too. And we cover a broad field. We all know that inclusive that riding and driving are both inclusive physical activities, and they have the potential to link urban and rural communities. These facts that I really love, these next bunch. We have the highest proportion of UK sport participants who are women, the highest proportion of UK sports participants who are over the age of 45, and the highest proportion of UK sports participants who are disabled. That's quite unique, and we should shout about it. We also have amazing programs for people facing challenges, be they mental, social, or physical. And we do amazing work for disadvantaged youth who are struggling with the standard educational program. And as we all know, men and women compete in equestrian disciplines on a truly equal basis. And we have an extraordinary profile. We're global leaders. We're not just global leaders in sport and racing and our breeding programs, but we're also global leaders in our welfare standards. As has already been mentioned, horse racing is the second largest spectator sport in the country and attracts a huge volume of international interest. All of this makes us a real soft power asset. Now that's a bit of a politician's phrase, but it's important. Soft power is the influence of those things that we do culturally. And it's the influence and the power of those things to persuade people to invest into the UK. So we are a soft power asset for the country and for the benefit of the government too. And other soft power assets would be things like the monarchy, the BBC, our great universities, Cambridge and Hull, I think, according to Blackadder. And from a sports perspective, all of our sports are soft power assets for the country, but for us, it's things like Ascot, it's things like badminton, the Royal Windsor Horse Show, it's organisations like the Pony Club, which really give us international soft power benefits. But despite being an amazing sector which has a big impact both on the economy and the social fabric of our society, and an inclusive and broad church on occasions, that is just our reputation. Like Emperor Ming wisely said, as you will all remember, we can't build it all on reputation. We need government to help us thrive and flourish, not just admire us from afar. So, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get government to help? And thank you, all of you who responded to the call for input before Christmas. We've had an amazing, amazing set of feedback on comments on our original draft, advice, guidance, suggestions. It was all really helpful and really well received, although, frankly, it was a pain in the backside because it then meant we had even more to try and squeeze into the second side of A4 in a concise and engaging manner. So, we've broken it down into four areas: partnerships, health and welfare, business, and opportunities. This is what government can do for us. Importantly, we're not asking government to put their hands in their pockets and cough up cash. We're not asking them to do this for us. We know that we as an industry have to lead on this, but what we want government to do is to enable it, is to open some doors for us, to make it easy for us to achieve our outcomes. So on partnerships, we need to make sure that all the legislation that's coming in and is aligned across the devolved across all the administrations. It's utterly bonkers that we have different sets of rules in Wales, in Scotland, in England, let alone the Northern Ireland problem, and we must do whatever we can to make sure that those pieces of legislation are aligned for the benefit of the horses and for the benefit of the industry. We need to develop and evolve a national disease protection plan, building on the amazing work that Richard Newton and his team have done, supported by funding from across all parts of the industry, not just the thoroughbred sector. But we also need government to engage in that, involve themselves with that, and facilitate that excellent work, because it's part of our drive to be biosecurity leaders globally. At a more local level, we need to make sure that we share animal welfare officers between local authorities. There is absolutely no point in having pockets of expertise if we have vast deserts of nothing in between. Much better that we share that expertise across the country. And when we're designing policies for our sector, we need to make sure that they're done in collaboration with government and other bodies. So we're co-designing rather than working on our own. On the health and welfare front, the critical enabler here is that ID and traceability legislation. That needs to get over the line. When it does, all sorts of other opportunities will open up for us. Evidently, we need to advance high standards of horse health and welfare, and we can do that in a number of ways. We need to address shortages when they occur. We'll all be conscious of the vaccine shortages that happened last year and the effect that that had. There are also shortages in healthcare providers, so vets and vet nurses and farriers are all struggling numbers-wise, and we need to address those sorts of challenges. We need to tackle the problems with drug resistance, both at antimicrobial and anthelmintic level, and we need government to support us in programs that will do that. These are not things that will cost government anything. These are simple changes or adaptations of the existing legislation that will enable us to protect us for the future. Equine businesses and charities that look after horses should be at least registered, possibly licensed. That will keep the good ones good, and it will mean the bad ones have to up their game. There would also benefit on health and welfare if we can improve our handling of welfare cases through the court process and the prosecutions. And finally, on health and welfare, equine research has been a shining beacon for the UK. We've had amazing funding for it through the Horse Race Betting Levy Board and other funding sources like the Horse Trust. That needs to be enabled going forward. We need to grow. We do not want that pot of equine research funding to shrink. On businesses, we need a skilled workforce. We talk about workforce every year. We need that facilitated by government. We need to be able to recruit and train more people, more fantastic members of our workforce. We need a border process that is smart. We want to be able to keep our borders biosecure. We want high level of welfare from the animals that are being imported. But we don't want to get in the way of legitimate business that already has amazing standards of horse welfare and already has high biosecurity standards. We also need to develop our existing markets and champion new ones, both within our products, our equestrian products, and our racing, our sports, and our breeding, and awareness of our amazing native breeds. And finally, there's a long list of opportunities there. I won't go through them all because you can read them and I'll show you how to access them later on. But there are a vast range of opportunities that we can take a massive advantage of if we choose and if we can get government to work with us. So, that's the 2 pages that we've ended up with. In the middle is a QR code. You can use your phone to take you through to a downloadable version of that. I'll re-enter the QR code will be on the last slide as well, if you don't get a chance to see it now. That will be going to all the political policy makers who are writing their party manifestos at the moment. It will also be going out to every single potential parliamentary candidate at the general elections, both in Westminster and in the devolved administrations. I don't imagine the policies that we've put forward here are going to be front page news in terms of Tory party manifesto or Labour party manifesto. But I hope at the very least this document will mean that those who are moving into power understand that we are an important part of society, understand that we are a valuable electorate that they need to take advantage of, and offer them opportunities for making the most for this industry by allowing us to flourish. So just to finish off...
We'll need to call it, don't we?
Yep. Just to finish off, there's times this year when I felt like marching into Defra offices and ranting and raving, but they are a friend. Lord Douglas Miller is newly involved. Sometimes we need to be a little bit more subtle in our approach. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. Come and join us on the stage. An excellent Blackadder quote, I thought. We do want to have questions via Slido. So if you're watching online or in person, please do use the Slido function and get some questions in for Andrew and David. So our final speaker is Andrew Voas, who's Veterinary Head of Animal Welfare for the Scottish Government, to discuss the recent consultation on licensing of equestrian premises in Scotland, something that David talked about in his presentation. Andrew's proudest riding achievement was as a student he accidentally, due to misidentification, rode an Exmoor pony, the wrong one, from a trekking herd on the Pennycook ride out. According to Andrew, both pony and he loved it, easily keeping up with the leaders. The owner of the Exmoor pony apparently was far less impressed, and unfortunately for Andrew, they were clearly someone to be deeply reckoned with, because they would become a pony club district commissioner and a chief veterinary officer. But fortunately for Andrew, 2 years after the ride, he also married the owner, Sheila Voas, current Scottish CVO. Andrew commented that she clearly had forgiven him. We've only got his word for that, though. Andrew.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Roly, for sharing that little anecdote. So I've been asked to talk to you today about the consultation on licensing equestrian premises in Scotland. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the background to why we've done this and go through some of the responses to the consultation, and then maybe say a few words about possible next steps. I normally put this slide in when I was giving talks at EU training events when we used to do that sort of thing, just to show people where Scotland was. I'm sure you all know where Scotland is, and I'm sure Lord Miller knows where Scotland is as well. But it's sometimes useful to remind some of my Defra colleagues in particular that Scotland is a separate country. We've had a separate legal system for centuries, and animal health and welfare, or almost all aspects of animal health and welfare, are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so decisions about welfare legislation are for Scottish ministers in Scotland. We have our Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act. It's very similar to the Animal Welfare Act in England and Wales, and this provides the basic protection for all kept animals and includes the offences of causing unnecessary suffering and makes an offence to fail to ensure that animals' welfare needs are met in accordance with good practice. And we publish codes of practice to explain what good practice is, and we have our Code of Practice for the Welfare of Equidae from 2010. It probably is due a bit of an update, but that's the basic outline of what we expect horse keepers to follow to make sure they're meeting horses' welfare needs. Moving on to history of riding establishments, I was quite interested looking back at the record of parliamentary proceedings in Hansard, that the first Riding Establishments Act came about in 1939, and this followed an uptake in riding for pleasure in the 1930s. Obviously, the era of horses being used for work was coming to an end, and people were taking up new healthy activities in the outdoors. And there seemed to be a boom of riding establishments, particularly around London, with a lot of new riding yards springing up and hiring out horses. Many of them apparently of dubious fitness and probably not really suitable for the owners. And there's some interesting comments there about the type of people who were setting up these yards. So as a result of that, there was this act in 1939. Originally, there were proposals that this should include a registration fee for riding establishments, but it seemed to have become a power for local authorities to appoint veterinary inspectors to go and see what was happening in these new riding yards to see that the horses were being looked after properly. Obviously, the Second World War then intervened, and the next development were the Riding Establishments Acts in 1964, and as they were amended in 1970. And this established the system that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, where vets who are appointed on a special panel come and inspect the horses and the tack and annually, and that seems to have been a fairly well accepted and useful system over many years to ensure horse welfare and also rider safety. We still have that legislation in England and Wales. in Scotland and Wales. In England, that's been replaced by the licensing activities involving animals regulations. I won't go into that, but that's maybe not been quite so warmly welcomed. That gives additional powers to local authorities. But I won't make any further comment on that. When it comes to livery yard regulation, this has been discussed for several years by a working group. So we set up an equine establishments working group involving Roly and some other people in the room. So this, in a way, is an example of working with industry to take forward proposals. And one of the main developments we considered was the BHS approved centre scheme. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is a very detailed set of criteria. There are 2 tiers, and if you want to be approved under the highest tier, there are over 100 different criteria covering animal welfare, design of the yard, elements that might be called customer satisfaction, such as the availability of hacking in the area and the qualifications and experience of the staff at the school. I think importantly, it includes elements of health and safety and child safeguarding, so it's a really thorough accreditation scheme. I think, unfortunately, though, in Scotland, we only currently have 8 approved BHS liveries. We do have riding schools, and some of the riding schools will offer liveries as well, but basically it seems to be a very thorough, very good scheme, but with limited take-up so far, at least in Scotland. And there are other assurance schemes, of course, as well. There's the ABRS and TRSS schemes. I should mention those. Talking about liveries, of course, there's lots of different types of livery and combinations of these types as well. So there's the full livery, there's part liveries, DIY stable liveries, DIY grass liveries, working liveries, schooling or breaking yards as well. And many of these may also be licensed riding establishments. And again, the livery versus riding establishment business may vary considerably. So we're dealing with quite a diverse sector. When we came to discuss the different issues that we were concerned about, we had to think about really what the purpose of regulation would be. Would it be primarily about ensuring horse welfare, or would it be more about disease control or traceability? There's the issues of public safety and accountability. So all these issues were considered, and if we're going to bring forward legislation, we need to think about all these things, but we probably need to focus on one particular aspect of that. Another important aspect we considered was the threshold for regulation, whether that's registration or licensing. Clearly, there's some very big commercial livery yards where people are making a business from that and employing staff. And I think there's general agreement that sort of, obviously, commercial establishment could be suitable for registration or licensing. But then there's many of these smaller sort of marginal situations where you maybe have a horse owner who has some land and they let out their grazing to friends or neighbours. And it can work very well in a fairly informal arrangement. Obviously, that can then grow and become more of a sort of informal economy type arrangement where people are basically operating a small business. But this difference between, or the threshold between when something becomes a private arrangement and becomes a small business, I think is quite interesting. And we obviously don't want to do anything that's going to be unnecessarily burdensome for the private or informal keepers, but does actually catch the larger commercial establishments. And remember, we have different types of approach, so we could potentially deal with this through guidance. We could talk about registration or licensing, and depending on what we're trying to achieve, something like registration, for example, might be more important if we're concerned about identifying where horses are kept. So the idea then would be to register as many places as possible so we have a record of where horses are. If we're concerned about more potentially burdensome conditions, then licensing might be a more appropriate option. And we basically, at the moment, we're sort of leaning towards the welfare concerns, and there are reports of welfare concerns in livery yards. These are some figures provided by BHS and World Horse Welfare. It's really just to give you an idea of the sort of complaints that are out there and are being received. There will be lots of other complaints received by Scottish SPCA and RSPCA. So this won't be all the complaints, but it gives you an idea of the sort of issues that have been identified at livery yards. We also have some very interesting information that's come from Gillian Turnbull, who's a lecturer in equine studies at SRUC. And she did a dissertation, it's not been published, but she did a lot of work in her MSc dissertation a couple of years ago. And that involved interviews with over 1,000 horse owners, livery yard owners, and equine vets. And in Scotland, she was able, through looking at advertising primarily or word of mouth, she identified 900 establishments that were clearly commercial liveries. Interestingly, of those, only 400 are on the local authority valuation roll. So yeah, that raises interesting questions about how we identify commercial livery yards, and are some of them operating under the radar. And this will almost certainly exclude a lot of the less formal, sort of semi-private arrangements that I've mentioned. Her research went into a lot of detail. It was really focused around the 5 welfare needs and the risks to those needs. So it wasn't necessarily identifying definite problems, but it was identifying areas where there were definite risks. And this included things like availability of feed and water, freedom from disease in terms of worming regimes, freedom from injury in terms of availability of veterinary care or hoof care, as well as issues about rugging and over-rugging, feeding and underfeeding. So quite a wide variety of potential concerns. It was interesting that most owners indicated, I think about 75 to 80% of them were generally satisfied, but there were these concerns coming out. It was also interesting that many horse owners believed that liveries were already required to be licensed and already required to be insured. So there may be a bit of a mismatch between what people think is already a legal requirement and what the reality is. So in Scotland, we have taken forward new legislation on licensing activities involving animals. We didn't include livery yards or riding establishments at the time, but we did introduce new legislation in these areas. The new features of the regs are flexible licenses, powers to revoke, suspend or vary licenses, and a fit and proper person test. And these are designed to make administration of licenses easier for local authorities, as well as having more detailed license conditions that we agreed with the main stakeholders. But this is really a modern framework that we intended to extend to new areas in future. And so the next development of that process was to consult on these other areas which we could potentially license. And this is where livery yards and riding establishments come in. Obviously, there's canine fertility services is a growing new area of concern, and greyhound racing was included in response to a campaign to ban greyhound racing in Scotland. So that's probably another talk at some point. And the proposed benefits we mentioned in the consultation were basically centred around better welfare and better socialisation opportunities and conditions that we could potentially apply to licences. We received a fairly large number of responses because we're consulting on a wide range of different activities. Not all of the responses are relevant to livery yards and riding establishments. We've now published the analysis of those responses, so if you want to see them, you can look at them through that link, and individual responses are published as well, so you can see what individual organisations have said. In terms of responses for livery yards, there's general support, but some concerns raised, mostly around local authority resources and expertise. We know local authorities are under a great deal of pressure, and there are concerns about local authority having sufficient staff and sufficiently experienced staff to administer some of the current licensing requirements, never mind new licensing requirements. And other issues, there was quite a strong recommendation from some respondees that registration might be a more proportionate approach for livery yards. In terms of riding establishments, there's general support, but many of the responses suggested that the legislation should be expanded to other activities where horses are used commercially for different purposes. And this is just one respondent came up with these 12 suggestions. And as you can see, it ranges from unicorn experiences to letting out horses for the common ridings. And if you go online, you can very quickly find a whole host of different types of animal experiences. I never knew pony parties were a big thing. I have to say the driving tuition and looks quite good fun, but yeah, and there's animals being taken into care homes as therapy pets. This seems to be a growing area of interest as well. I certainly never thought I sound a bit like a character from Harry Potter's Ministry of Magic, but we're now talking about possibly licensing activities involving mythical beasts, so I don't think we want to necessarily go down that route. Next steps. I haven't brought my crystal ball with me, continuing the Harry Potter theme, but we will now be preparing recommendations for our minister, so we're in the process of doing that. I can't say exactly where we'll go because we have a new minister. We need to have these discussions with him and explain the responses to the consultation, explain the different options that are available. But we will be publishing a response to the consultation in due course, hopefully not before not too long. And then we'll move on to developing possible regulations and guidance, if in fact that's what we decide to do. So I'd just like to say thanks to Gillian Turnbull for the survey information and for Sheila for providing the pictures. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you. Come and take a seat. Glad to see you're still trying to get into Sheila's good books by thanking her. That's excellent. Right, we have got a few minutes for questions. So we've got a couple of microphones. Let's take one from Slido first, which for you, David. Beverly from Sims from BHS says, how can the BHC ensure that the manifesto encourages diversity and inclusion in all 4 of its pillars or strands?
Thanks very much, Roly. Thanks, Beverly. Great question. I think diversity and inclusivity is clearly something that we need to address across the whole of the profession. Some areas we tackle it incredibly well, some areas we're very, very poor at it. I wonder if this is an issue that we need government help with, and therefore we need to be telling government what we need their help with or not. I can't think of how government can help us with that, but I'm very keen to hear if anyone's got any suggestions. What I do know is that we as an industry need to do this ourselves. And I can speak for the British Equine Veterinary Association. We're pushing all our trustees through inclusivity training. We're developing a policy. We're trying to collaborate with others in the industry. I know that the BEF is working hard on its diversity and inclusivity policy. I know that the BHA has done some amazing work, and we've just in the last couple of days actually, I've started talking to them about how the veterinary industry can collaborate with the British Horse Racing Association in terms of developing more inclusivity. But for me, I'm not sure, whilst it's obviously a critically important thing for the industry to address, I think it's for the industry to address rather than for us to tell government they can help us with it.
Thank you, David. Any questions from the floor? Yes, here at the front here.
Siobhan Dillon from the Institute of Applied Equine Podiatry. I was considering about the regulations or that kind of thing that you're talking about in Scotland, and I was wondering, what are the threshold differences that you would envisage in your registration for welfare concerns in comparison to the welfare regulation that you already have?
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and in our existing regulations, we did have to set thresholds, and for example, for animal welfare establishments, we said if people were keeping 5 or more horses, then they're required to be licensed. But in a way, it is arbitrary, and clearly there can be welfare problems in small yards where people are only keeping 1 or 2 horses. But we have to be, I think, practical, and there has to be a balance between what's reasonable to ask local authorities to enforce, and I think that's why we have tended to concentrate on the larger, clearly commercial type of activities. But it is, I do realise it is a difficult question, exactly where we draw the
So,
line.
so in principle, what I'm really sort of saying is, if there are welfare concerns, how is it that the Welfare Act, as it stands, cannot address those?
Well,
Sorry, we need to be brief, Andrew.
Okay, yeah, the Welfare Act can address those. The argument for licensing is it's really getting the chance to look at places that might not come to the attention of the public. That's basically it.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, at the back. Before we go to that, I'll just take one for you, Andrew. To ensure welfare regulation is effective in Scotland, what provision is the Scottish Government making for training and education, both for those being subject to licensing and those tasked with its enforcement?
Well, on the enforcement side, we do have a working group with local authorities where we've discussed the problems that they've experienced with our current registration scheme. We did make an online training course available for them that was developed by the Scottish SPCA. So if we do go down that route of licensing equine establishments, then that's the sort of thing that we might want to bring forward. Yeah.
And we're almost out of time. One question here.
Sorry. So as a newcomer into the equine industry, my question to you, sir, is you mentioned that you and your better half have owned horses. So I wanted to ask you, which is that one welfare issue that you would say that you've personally faced and a possible solution to overcome it?
So let's ask that to both. Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. Yeah, I suppose it's issues about competence and training, and where you have the livery yard systems situation, I think there are lots of examples where there can be sort of local practices or local myths in the yard, and people tend to believe each other or believe experienced people in the neighbourhood rather than listening to vets. I think that's quite a
peer pressure. Yeah, absolutely. David?
I think there's both a professional and a personal area here. On the professional, we constantly see welfare challenges, and we have to challenge ourselves as vets as to how we address those and how we make a differentiation between what's in the best interest of our business and what's in the best interest of the horse. I think we usually get that right. I think as a horse owner, like probably most horse owners in the room, timing of a decision for euthanasia is a challenge. So when you've got a favourite horse that you've known and ridden and enjoyed for many years and it's coming to the end of its days, getting it right is very difficult.
Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent questions, excellent answers. Thank you to our three presenters. I'm now going to hand back to Pat to move on to our next session. Thank you very much.